God, let a word go forth today that might encourage somebody in this place, oh God. God, I ask that you have your way in this place, God. That you have your way through me, oh God. And in Jesus' name, let us all say together, let us say amen.
Amen.
Amen. Come on, give God another hand clap of praise. Good morning, Grace.
Good morning.
Good morning, Grace.
Good morning.
The title of today's sermon is Rejoicing Over the Lost and Found. Rejoicing over the lost and found. And today's message deals with the subject of grace. And the idea of rejoicing over the lost and found comes from the parable that is found in the Gospel of St. Luke chapter 15. And the theme for this parable is so powerful that it made its way into a very famous song that we all know as Amazing Grace. And the words of this song, Amazing Grace, were written and inspired by the life of a man named John Newton. And as the story is written, John Newton was a slave trader. He was a slave trader who had been taught the scripture by his mother at a very young age. But he ended up living a life that eventually led him astray. And Newton's path led him the way, as I said, of becoming a trader of the lives of people. But not only did he become a trader of slaves, but Newton also lived the kind of life that discouraged others from following their path to God's salvation. And at one point in Newton's life, he was actually known as the great blasphemer. But how many people know that as bad as some of us are, that God has a way of getting our attention? Amen. How many know that no matter what some of us may have done, that God always has a way of bringing us back home? Yes. And God will do whatever it takes in order to save a soul that has been lost. So one day while Newton was sailing at sea, he found himself in the middle of a storm, and the storm was so violent that it threatened to destroy the ship and to end his life. And out of desperation, Newton did like many of us do when we find ourselves in the middle of life's storms and we find ourselves in situations that are beyond our control. And Newton began to remember the teachings of his childhood. He began to think on the things that his mother had taught him about the Lord. And in the midst of his storm, he cried out to God, and the God of mercy heard his cry and answered his prayers, and God saved his life. From that day forward, Newton began to turn his life around, and eventually he became a minister of the gospel. And in 1772, he wrote a poem that was presented to his congregation on New Year's Day of 1773. And the words of that song began like this. It says, Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. And the words of this song have been sang over the years by many groups of people to encourage themselves that even in the midst of calamitous circumstances, that the grace of God is strong enough to deliver us in our times of trouble. That even though we may not live perfect lives, and I know somebody in here knows what I'm talking about this morning, but the grace of God is still willing to save us from our sins. Yeah. So every time we sing this song, Amazing Grace, what we are doing is that we are thanking God for God's amazing grace. We are thanking God that even though sometimes we might lose our way throughout this life, that the grace of God is still waiting to lead us back home.
Amen.
We're thanking God that even though we sometimes find ourselves deep in sin, that when we cry out to God, that God still hears and God still answers our prayers. So as we talk about rejoicing over the lost and found this morning, we have to remember that the only reason that we were able to be found in the first place is because of the grace of a loving and a merciful God. And somebody in here besides me this morning ought to be happy about the grace of God. Somebody in here besides me this morning ought to be thankful about the grace of our God. Because all of us in here at one time or another have been beneficiaries of the grace of Almighty God. Now, when we talk about this thing called Grace Church, we're talking about the free and the unmerited and the undeserved favor of God. It's the undeserved kindness that God shows us that leads God to save us from our sins and to bless us even in spite of us. Because, church, the grace of God is so good to us that instead of God giving us what we know we truly deserve, how many know that God chose to give us Jesus Christ instead? And Jesus was willing to give his life and to take our place so that we might be saved.
Thank you, Lord.
And so that we might be reconciled to God.
Yes.
Church, God's grace is something that we cannot buy.
Yes.
God's grace is something that we cannot earn. And God's grace is something that our works cannot dare to accomplish. For the Bible says in John 3:16 that for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. So what that says to me is that everlasting life with God is based on our faith. And in order to obtain this promise from God, the thing that God asks us for is not necessarily our works, church, but our faith in Jesus Christ. That's why I believe that Paul said in Ephesians 2:8, for it is by grace that you have been saved through faith, and it is not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, so that no one can boast. And even though faith should lead us to do good works, it's not the good works that actually save us. Amen, somebody. Amen. But it's by the grace of God through our faith in Jesus Christ that God gives us this marvelous gift of salvation. Amen. And I know that some of us look really good and we look real holy here this morning praising God on a Sunday morning. But how many know that if we would really take the time to look back over our lives, we would understand just how significant God's grace has really been toward us? Amen. Because see, based on the way that some of us used to behave, and let's tell the truth on ourselves this morning, Christians, based on the way that some of us still struggle with certain things even out in our lives today. Yes. If God were to give us what we actually deserve, based on our behavior, how many know that many of us will still be lost? Amen. Some folk will still be out there addicted. Some folk would still be out there in abusive situations. Amen. Some folk would still be overwhelmed with depression. Some folk might even be lost in their graves. Yes. Amen. Yo, what I'm talking about this morning is grace. And aren't you glad that you know enough about the love of God that you get to sing this song about God's amazing grace? Amen. 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 Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Somebody in here ought to remember where you were and what you were doing when God found you.
Amen.
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 Now in our text today, we're looking at the Gospel of St. Luke. And Luke was believed to be a disciple of Paul, and the fact that Luke and Paul were acquainted actually makes a whole lot of sense, because Luke was a Gentile and Paul was a minister to the Gentiles. Based on their writing, church, both of them were called to speak to people who knew what it felt like to be disregarded, people who knew what it felt like to be marginalized and to be left out. Now, Gentiles in the Bible days were those who didn't have access to the law of Moses. They were also uncircumcised, so they didn't have within their bodies the mark that represented the covenant or the promises of God. And according to the law, Gentiles were considered to be sinners. Likewise, church, there were also certain Jews who some law-abiding Jews also believed that they were sinners. And for one reason or another, the law-abiding Jews considered their counterparts to be unrighteous and undeserving of the promises of God. So they engaged in practices that separated themselves from those they considered to be the other. So when we look at chapter 15, this is an opportunity for Jesus to speak to those who are the religious elite. And verse 1 says that now all the tax collectors and the sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus, and the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and he eats with them." Now the Pharisees and the scribes were the religious leaders. They were the ones who believed that they were all right with God. They were the ones who were considered to be righteous, and they believed that their righteousness gave them access to the promises of God. And the reason that they believed this way was because they were the ones who observed the law. These were they who felt justified because of their works, you all. But the problem with the way that they believed and behaved was that many times their religious practices caused them to separate themselves from others in order to keep themselves from becoming clean, as if the sin of somebody else is going to just rub off on them. In modern time, church, I believe that these people might represent those ultra-religious church folk who believe that because of their grandiose works of righteousness, that they are the only ones who have access to the promises of God, while those who are sinners and those who are struggling and even those who have yet to know the Lord don't deserve the same blessings and the same access to God that they believe that they have. And I'm sure that we can all identify someone, some Christian that we know who is so holier than thou that they believe that God's love and God's grace and God's mercy and God's blessings are for them and them alone. Am I by myself in here this morning?
Amen.
But when we look at the text, church, what we see is that Jesus is welcoming and eating with sinners, that Jesus was hanging out with the very people who the religious folk didn't think deserved to be in the presence of the Lord. And what they do is like some other church folk do, and they begin grumbling and complaining. Like, who do they think they are coming into the presence of the Lord? Who do they think they are lifting up their hands and praising God? Who do they think they are? Because they don't belong to be in the church among the likes of us. Now let's be real with ourselves for a moment this morning, church. Who in here really believes that based on your works that you deserve the blessings of God? Amen, somebody.
Amen.
Most of us, church, if we are honest with ourselves, can recognize that even though we come to church on Sunday morning, and even though we come to Bible study on Wednesday evenings, and even though we walk around toting our Bibles and listening to gospel songs at work, that we are still not perfect, and at times in our lives, as Christian as we have fallen prey to sin. And the truth of the matter, church, is that our sin is the reason that we needed Jesus in the first place. Romans 3:23 says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." And if we look at that verse, you all, what we see is that even though the word sinned is written in the past tense, the phrase fall short is written in the present tense. And what that says to me, you all, is that from time to time we still fall short, and from time to time we still mess up, and from time to time, how many know that we still make mistakes? Because sometimes, church, even as born again, blood-bought Christians who love the Lord, sometimes we still miss the mark. Amen. And sometimes we sin. Amen. But aren't you glad that you have access to Jesus? Yes. Aren't you glad that Jesus doesn't mind welcoming and communing with sinners? Aren't you glad that Jesus isn't like a whole lot of other church folk who will cast you off and write you off and cast you aside simply because you are not living up to their standards of righteousness? And if the truth be told, and I came here to tell the truth on somebody this morning, but I don't believe that even the so-called self-righteous folk truly believe that they are all that they claim to be either, because how many know that when nobody else is watching, I believe that everybody in some area of their lives is still in need of grace, and still in need of mercy, and still in need of the forgiveness of Almighty God. And somebody in there ought to say amen. So when we look at the text, church, what we see is that Jesus is eating with tax collectors and sinners, and we know how the Jews felt about tax collectors, because tax collectors had a very bad reputation, and much of that reputation was very much deserved, because many of them took advantage of the people, and many of them lived very dishonest lives. And what I'm not saying this morning is that it's just okay for us just to live any old kind of way, and that it's okay for us just to treat people any old kind of way. No, don't leave out of here saying that the pastor said that I can just treat you any old kind of way and I'm going to be all right with God. That's not what I'm saying this morning. But what I am saying, church, is this: that people who live in glass houses ought not throw stones. And that none of us is so holy that we should think that we are the only ones who should be able to access the grace of the Lord. Because sinners are the ones who need Jesus the most. That's right. I'm the one who needs Jesus the most. Amen. Tell the truth on yourself this morning. You are the one who needed Jesus the most. Yes. The folk who hurt you are the ones who still need Jesus the most. The people who have lied on you are the ones who still need Jesus the most. The people who have cheated on you are the ones who still need Jesus the most. The folk who continue to do you wrong, those are the ones who still need Jesus the most. The folk you don't like, we all need Jesus. So in the text, church, Jesus is spending time with the people who actually need Jesus the most. The people who realize that something in my life is missing. The folk who realize that just because I'm a sinner, that doesn't mean that I'm undeserving of the grace of God, because Jesus is the way to my salvation. So all the tax collectors and the sinners, you all, they were coming to Jesus. And the Pharisees and the scribes, the religious church folk, had a problem with them spending time with the Lord. So in response to their complaining, Jesus begins to tell them this parable. And he says it in verse 4, which of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? Now, the first thing that I want to point out to you all this morning is that Jesus is telling a parable of a shepherd going after one sheep that is lost. And within this parable, Jesus is comparing himself to a shepherd. And the lost sheep is represented by the tax collectors and the sinners, and the 99 are considered to be those who believe themselves to be righteous. And even though we respect the shepherd now, we venerate the shepherd now, we uphold the shepherd now, in those days, the job of a shepherd was a job that really was not considered to be very upstanding. Shepherds were considered to be lazy and shiftless. Sometimes they were even considered to be thieves. You all, being a shepherd was a dirty job and a thankless job. And sometimes it prevented them from going to the temple, from coming to church and worshiping with the other believers. So when Jesus begins this story by aligning himself with a shepherd, immediately what he does is that he identifies himself as among those who are considered to be lowly and despised. And that's the kind of Savior that we have, church. The kind of Savior who knows what it feels like to be marginalized. The kind of Savior who knows what it feels like to be misjudged. He's the kind of Savior who knows what it feels like to be rejected, knows what it feels like to be lied on, knows what it feels like to be mocked, and knows what it feels like to be abused, all because he did not fit into the standard that the religious society of the day had put in place to separate themselves from people they considered to be unrighteous.
Amen.
And it was all because the religious leaders refused to challenge themselves to realize that Jesus had come to save that which was lost. And aren't you glad that you have a Savior who can identify with the likes of you and me, church? Aren't you glad that you have a Savior who knows what it feels like to be misjudged and misunderstood? Aren't you glad that you have a Savior who knows what it feels like to have to suffer and to die and to pay the price for your sins?
Amen.
Church, we serve a God who gave God's only begotten Son to live a life of being misunderstood by religious folk and to die on a cross like a criminal for the sins of the world. And it is nothing but the grace and the mercy and the love of God that would allow the Son of God to come down from glory and live the kind of life and die that kind of death on behalf of sinners like you and like me.
Amen.
Now, the other thing that I want to bring to your attention are the 99 sheep who are in this parable. And again, the 99 sheep represent the Pharisees and the scribes, and these are the people who have and who practice the law. These are the people who believe that they are doing all the right things the right way. In fact, later in the Gospel of Luke chapter 18, Jesus tells another parable about a Pharisee and a tax collector, and both of them have gone to the temple. Y'all, both of them have come to church, but when the Pharisee stands up to pray, he begins to thank God that he is not like all collector. But Jesus says that even though the tax collector realized that he was a sinner because of his humility and because of his honesty, that he was the one who left the temple more justified than the other. So the message from Jesus to the 99 who believe themselves to be righteous is that the message of the gospel, church, is not just for a certain group of people, but the good news of God's grace is for everybody who is willing to believe, especially to those who might be lost. And some folk might think when they are reading this story of the shepherd and the lost sheep that even though the shepherd has lost one sheep, that at least the shepherd still has 99 left. Amen. But my question to you all this morning is, what if you were the one who was lost?
Come on now.
What if you were the one who had gone astray?
That's right.
And see, I for one am glad that I serve a God who did not forget about me when I was lost, y'all. I for one am glad that even though God had other folk who were still in the flock who might have been behaving way more righteously than I was, that God didn't leave me lost in my sin, y'all. I for one am glad that even though I can tell the truth on myself, if nobody else will, but I stepped away from the fold for a little while, but God still had enough love for me that God came and God found me and God rescued me and God saved me and God still brought me right on back home. And see, that's the other thing that I want us to notice about this parable here is that the shepherd is the one who went out after the lost sheep. And I know a lot of times we talk about the fact that we found God, that we found salvation, that we found the Lord. But the truth of the matter, church, is that we weren't the ones who found God, but God was the one who found us in sin, who came after us and brought us back home. Church, the one in this parable is the one who was lost. The one in this parable is the one who needs God's help the most. And I want to remind all of us in here this morning that at one time or another, that all of us was that one. Somebody say, I was that one.
I was that one.
And the fact that you were the one that needed the Lord and that God loved you enough to come after you ought to make you grateful for the grace and the mercy of God, because God loves the one who needs God the most. God loves the one who other folk have rejected. God loves the one who other folk have walked away from. God loves the one who other folk has despised. God loves even the one who is lost and gone astray.
Amen.
Now, a lost sheep in those days was in a whole lot of danger, and a sheep without a shepherd would surely end up dying or being killed. But a good shepherd would risk his life for his sheep. And Jesus even said in John chapter 10 that a good shepherd knows his sheep by name. And aren't you glad in here this morning to know that you serve a Lord who knows you by name? Because see, every single sheep, even the small ones, even the weak ones, even the most vulnerable ones are important to the shepherd.
Amen.
And that's one of the things that I believe that God loved about David, because the Bible teaches us that when David was a shepherd and he cared for his father's sheep, that when a lion or a bear came and tried to take the sheep away, that David put his life on the line for the sheep, and David rescued the sheep from the mouths of the beast. And when they turned on him, he fought them off with all that he had. And the Bible says that with the help of God, he was able to save those sheep and to kill both the lion and the bear. So a good shepherd will go after even one sheep. And a good shepherd will do whatever it takes to rescue his sheep from the way of danger. And aren't you glad that you have a shepherd who will come after you wherever you are, church? Aren't you glad that you have a shepherd who loves you so much that he is willing to do whatever it takes just to remove you out of harm's way? Aren't you glad today, church, that you have a shepherd who is willing to lay his life on the line for you, to go to a cross for you, and who is willing to die for you so that you might live? Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Church, the Bible doesn't even really tell us how the sheep got lost. But we might just assume that the sheep had maybe just kind of wandered off, and we can probably guess that maybe something had caught that sheep's attention that caused it to go astray and that caused it to get lost. And when we look at the whole of chapter 15, what we have, you all, are three examples of something that was lost and something that was found. And in the third parable, in chapter 15, it talks about this lost prodigal son. And we all know from that parable that the son had taken a portion of his father's fortune with his disrespectful self, and he spent his living on things that had taken his attention off of things that really mattered. But see, before we judge the prodigal son, isn't that something that we tend to do sometimes, church? Because sometimes we find ourselves getting distracted by things that are not of God, and we find ourselves focusing on things that take our focus off of the plan of God for our lives, and we find ourselves, tell the truth on yourself this morning, going after things and chasing after lifestyles and following after people who take us out of the fold and cause us to get lost. Amen. But aren't you glad?
Thank you, Lord.
That even though we are the ones who sometimes choose to take our focus off of God, that God does not take God's focus off of us, church? Aren't you glad that even when we turn our backs on God, that God loves us so much that God does not turn God's back on us? And even though we are the ones who go astray, aren't you glad that God does whatever it takes to come after us and keep on looking and keep on searching until God finds us where we are and brings us back on home, church? That is what happened in the second parable in chapter 15. There was a woman who had a coin that was lost, and that coin was equal to about 1 day's wages. So to some people, they might think that that's not a whole lot of money. It's only one coin, but I still have 9 more. But to that woman, even though it was only one coin, the parable says that she was determined, so she swept that house up and down and back to front until she found that one that was lost. And when she found that coin, the Bible said that she called all of her friends together and said, "Come on over here and rejoice with me, girl, because I have found that which was lost." And just like the son was lost and found, the father and the whole household began to rejoice. Almost. Because see, the lingering question in all three of these parables in chapter 15 is, what will the righteous do when the lost have been found? You all, Jesus said in verse 5 that when the shepherd found the sheep, he laid it on his shoulders and he began to rejoice. Then when he came home, he called together all of his friends and all of his neighbors, and he said to them, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that that was lost. And then we get to the conclusion of the parable in verse 7, and it says, just so I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous folk who think they don't need to repent.
Amen.
Now, when we look at that word repentance, repentance simply means to think differently after, to change one's mind. And in this context, it means to change from unbelief to belief. So what Jesus is talking about here is this thing called faith, which is the key to our salvation.
Yes.
And the message from Jesus to the so-called righteous Pharisees and scribes is that I know you believe yourselves to be righteous. I know you believe that you are okay with God. But how righteous are you really if you cannot rejoice over the fact that I came to preach the gospel to all of God's people? How righteous are you really if you can rejoice at the hope that Jesus came to save that which was lost? How righteous are you really if you can rejoice in the belief that God's grace is not just for you, but that God's grace is available to everybody, even to the sinner?
Amen.
Because the problem with most believers is that when it comes to other folk and their sin, they believe that other folk are deserving of God's judgment. You know how we do. Because if you mess with me, I will not to get you. Right? But when it comes to us and our sin, then we want to be able to enjoy and benefit from God's grace. But I came this morning to remind us that the grace of God is not just for a select group of people, but the grace of God is available to all of God's children, especially those who need God's grace the most.
Amen.
Church, Jesus came to seek after and to save the lost. And most of us know that we are among those who were in need of this grace. And many of us know that we are still in need of God's grace even after we've gotten to know Jesus. And this grace that we are talking about this morning, you all, is God's unmerited favor. This grace we're talking about this morning gives us access to God's undeserved blessings, including this blessing we call salvation. And I believe that the grace of God is available to all of us, regardless of how badly we may have sinned. Because Jesus came to seek and save the lost. And as Christians, I believe it's our responsibility to spread the gospel that God's love and God's mercy and God's grace are for anybody and everybody, especially to those who need the most. Amen. Even to those who've hurt us. Amen. Even to those who we might not particularly like. Amen. Even to those whose sins we perceive to be greater than ours. Because no matter how grave the sin, how we know that God's grace and God's mercy are sufficient. Right. So as we go forth from this place this morning, I want to ask all of us a few thought-provoking questions. Are we able to believe that no matter how great the sin, that the grace of God is sufficient and able to forgive? Not just you and me, but everybody else too. Are we able to believe that the grace of God isn't something that can be earned, but that the grace of God is given freely to all those who are willing to believe? Yeah. And finally, are we able to rejoice with God and the angels and the whole house of God over what has been lost and what has been found? Amen. Church, all of us ought to be thankful for this song called Amazing Grace. Because at some point in all of our lives, tell the truth, church, all of us need the undeserved grace of God. Amen. Because at some point in our lives, how many know that all of us were lost? Yes. But thanks to God's grace, all of us have been able to be found.
Amen.
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 Why don't you all give God a hand clap? We thank you for this day. We thank you for this word. We thank you for this place called Grace, God. I thank you for the grace of God and the love of God and the forgiveness of God, dear Lord. God, I thank you that His word has been sown on good ground and that it shall bring forth much fruit in the lives of these your people. And let us all say together, let us say, Amen.
Amen.